In this video, I'm going to show you how to create the Dino Egg project. This is an example of a finished Dino Egg. So it has a hinge and the egg cracks open and reveals the little dinosaur that's on the inside. And you can see its little hands are grabbing on here to one of the broken edges of the egg. So this uses two different watercolor techniques. One is salt to create a visual texture, so you can see the cool pattern that the salt creates. And then the other one that we're using is wax resist. So these little patterns on the dinosaur head were made with crayons, and then when you go over it with the watercolor, it resists. So let's take a look at the supplies that we're going to need. So obviously you need watercolor paper. This is 12 by 18 inch and it's 140 pound watercolor paper, which is pretty nice watercolor. We also have the drawing guide that is available on the internet. We'll be using liquid watercolors. You could also use pan watercolor, and this is the watercolor that I'm using, and you add, or I added, 2 tablespoons of water and 1 teaspoon of the concentrated liquid watercolor into each one of these salsa cups to make a few colors that I wanted to use. You obviously will need a brush and a cup with water in it. You will need a marker and a pencil. You will need crayons. These are special crayons. They're construction paper crayons, but regular crayons would work as well. You'll need a hole puncher, scissors, tape, glue, salt, and a brad or brass fastener. And if you don't have a brass fastener, you could just, I don't know, use like a staple or just glue your egg so that it's in the open position. But the brad fastener is pretty cool because it makes it interactive so that you can move the egg open and closed. I made an experiment as a low-cost alternative. So for this, I used regular paper and regular construction paper instead of watercolor paper. And if I hold these two up, you can see that there is a huge difference between the quality of the finish that you can get. The watercolor paper is much more vibrant. It's heavy duty and it really holds up to a watery medium. The construction paper is, it leaves visible lines, and it doesn't hold up as well to the water, but it is far less expensive than watercolor paper, so sometimes you have to make do with the supplies and the budget that you have. So in the salt would not work at all on the construction paper, so I used watered down tempera paint and I just spattered it to give it that visual texture. Then continuing with the low-cost theme, I used heavyweight construction paper instead of watercolor paper, and I just used colored paper and then used the construction paper crayons to color in the teeth and to color in the dots, the pattern on the head of the dinosaur. And the construction paper crayons have a very nice solid finish on on the construction paper. So they work really well. Regular crayons will work too, but they won't look quite as nice. So all in all, if depending on what your resources are, this is an option of another way that you could do this project. There are two different ways that you can approach creating the egg. One, for younger students, you might consider using a template. So you could draw an egg yourself and trace it onto poster board and have a few templates that you can use at different tables around the classroom. But sometimes it's good to have the students practice drawing, so that is not a bad thing. So how are you going to approach drawing an egg? Well, what I like to do is draw a circle first on the bottom. So using as much of the paper as I can, I'm going to draw with sketchy lines, and you'll notice I'm using my hand kind of as a fulcrum, a pivot point as I'm making my circle. And then as I get over to this side, I'll just bring that across. And first I'm drawing with kind of sketchy lines, and the lines that I like I will make darker. Now I'm going to turn my paper around, and this part of the egg, I'm going to go right in the center of the paper here, is going to be a smaller point. We all know that eggs are white at one end and taper at the other end. So now what I'm going to do is simply connect this point and this point together with my kind of sketchy lines. And I'll do the same thing on this side. And there we go. I will outline that with black so that you can see it better. So even if the students' eggs are going to turn out to be lopsided and kind of strange looking, that's okay. They have to learn how to draw sometime, so they might as well learn in your class. So give them the opportunity and they will have fun. Now that my egg is cut out, it's time to paint it. On one side of the egg, you might have pencil or marker lines, so flip the egg over to the clean side. I'm going to use liquid watercolors, but you could also use pan watercolors. So we're going to use a technique that's called wet in wet, and what that means is that you use lots of water and you just let the colors mix on the paper while they're still wet, and they'll create new colors. So it's important to work kind of fast, and you can see that you get some really pretty effects. And the last thing that I'm going to do while my watercolor paint is still really wet is take some table salt and sprinkle it all over my egg. If your egg has dried out in areas, you can just take plain water right out of your cup and get it a little bit more wet. So I can see that I have an area over here where it dried out a little bit, so I'm going to just swoosh it with some plain clear water, and then I will drop my salt on top of that. So the salt is going to create a really neat visual texture. Now the trick is, after you put the salt on, don't put any more paint on it. You just have to let it dry. Now it's time to draw the dinosaur. So using the drawing guide and a piece of 9 by 12 watercolor paper or possibly 8.5 by 11 cardstock paper, let's go ahead and make our drawing. So I'm going to draw using a permanent black marker so that you can see it really well. The students could use pencil or they could use a crayon or a marker. Let's go ahead and get started. So I'm going to draw a nice oval for the eyeball and color it in. Then from there, I'm going to draw a nice big smile line down to the side of the paper. And now I'm going to make the nose curve up like a big bump and kind of curve and make the back of the head and go all the way down to the bottom of the paper. Now the jawline is going to stick out a little bit, so I'm going to extend the line and then come under and make a little curve for the neck and end up down here at the bottom of the paper. Next, I'm going to draw the paws. So here's just a straight line and a W and another straight line, W, and another straight line. Next, I'm going to add some colored dots. This is a little bit of pattern on my dinosaur. So I'm going to make all sorts of circles. They're going to be large and small and different shapes. Okay, now that my pattern is drawn with crayon, I forgot something very important, the teeth. So let's draw a zigzag line. There we go. So now I'm going to paint in my dinosaur, and I want it to be a contrasting color to my egg. So my egg was blue and green with splashes of yellow. So I'm going to make my dinosaur completely bright yellow. And you'll notice that I'm painting right over the top of the orange dots, but they are resisting the watercolor because they are wax. So nothing is happening to the color of them. And I can paint outside the lines if I want to, because I am going to cut this out. But what I don't want to do is paint the teeth, because I want the teeth to be white. So I will have to be careful when I get to that area. And slow down and paint carefully around the teeth. Oh darn, I see I forgot another thing, and that is the nostril. So when I got to the area where the nostril is supposed to be, I noticed that I didn't draw it. So I'm going to pause in just a minute and draw that nostril on there. So let's get all of this watercolor on here. And you'll notice that I went into the tooth a little bit. So I'm just going to take a piece of paper towel and fold it into a point and try to pick up and dry off that little spot right there. And that cleaned that up pretty well. Okay, let's get the rest of this dino painted. And now I'm going to go back and draw my C-shaped nostril on there. And you know, I actually could have added this after the watercolor dried too. that would work just fine. And I probably am going to have to go back and do that anyway and make that a little bit darker. So let's see here. And now down here on my paws, I'm just going to give those a quick coat. And there we go. The dinosaur is finished, and when it dries, I will cut it out. All of my paint is dry now, so I cut out my dinosaur, and I'm going to put him to the side for a minute. So my egg turned out really nicely. The salt made a really cool implied texture on the surface of the egg. So what I'm going to do now is just brush my fingers across the surface of the egg and remove the salt that's on it. Kind of just brush it towards the center. And then you can tap that into a trash can. Okay, now I'm going to flip my egg over, and approximately in the middle of the egg, I'm going to draw a series of zigzag lines, and this is going to be where the egg is cracking open. So now I'll just take my scissors and cut right along those lines. And this was great practice for students, having this scissor control, following along a line. You may have to help some students, but that's okay. They have to learn sometime. So this is all good practice. All right. There we go. So now I am going to put a hole in this area right here so I can make a hinge. So I'm going to overlap this, and I suspect that this part you will have to do as the teacher. So I'm overlapped that, and I'm going to use my hole punch and make a hole through both sections there. And I think that's just a little bit too much for little hands to deal with. So you might just have to set aside some time and do that for them. So now I'm putting the brad through the hole and then flipping it over on the back and bending open the little metal prongs on the back. So now my egg has a hinge. Pretty cool. So my little paws or feet, hands, looks like I have to trim them down just a little bit, so I will snip off a little on each paw, and then I'll use just plain old white school glue. And I'll glue that to one side of the opening. I had a little bit of salt left on there. And put some glue on the back of this paw. Glue that down on the other side. You might have to hold that down and count to 15 slowly. There we go. Now with my dinosaur, I'm going to tuck that behind there, and when the egg's closed, I want him to be relatively, him or her, to be relatively inside the egg. So I don't want it so far up that it's popping out of the top there necessarily. So I'm going to say somewhere right about there, and then I'll move it around maybe something like that. Okay, now I'm going to get my tape and I'm going to hold this in place and then flip it and try not to move it too much. Then I will just tape this down. I think you could also use glue. Again, this is a part that you may have to help your students with. If they're kindergarten, probably for sure. If they're in second grade, maybe not. So you'll have to judge that. And there we go. Our finished dino in the egg. Isn't that adorable? Have fun with this project.